Hi, everybody. My name is Peggy Epic. On behalf of the Lancaster Conservancy, welcome to this evening's Nature Hour, the last presentation of the season, but the one to launch us into the new spring season outdoors. As you'll learn in tonight's lecture, now is the time to get out on our preserves and be part of an amazing unfolding of spring wildflowers, bursting buds, and wildlife emergence. Lancaster Conservancy's mission is to provide wild and forested lands and clean waterways for our community forever. We protect and steward the ancestral lands of the Susquehannock, the Conestoga, and Shanks Ferry people, and acknowledge and honor both the past and present Native peoples who have cared for these beautiful places. For 50 years, our organization has sought out natural places that are so precious and beautiful that they must be protected. Our stewardship team works to restore these special places by creating trails, planting trees, and restoring critical ecological communities where you and I can hike, hunt, fish, and observe nature 365 days a year. We launched Nature Hour with the goal of bringing an assortment of local and regional experts directly to your home with presentations that help us better understand the Conservancy's work and the work of our community partners. Tonight's presentation by Lancaster Conservancy's own Keith Williams will no doubt give you a taste of some of the amazing springtime landscapes found on our preserves. You'll want to head out soon. Be sure to visit our webpage and find opportunities to join a guided hike or participate in a class about hiking with our upcoming Happy Hiker series, find trail maps, or join in to help with a restoration or stewardship project. Tonight's lecture, Spring in Bloom, a guide to our ephemeral wildflowers, will be a 40 to 45-minute presentation, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll include your questions as part of our conversation. Before I formally introduce my colleague and tonight's presenter, I'd like to thank our incredible corporate and annual sponsors who support the mission of Lancaster Conservancy, including our work in education and outreach like Nature Hour. On behalf of Lancaster Conservancy, sincere thanks to the Winger Group, Perky Pets, Clark Associates, DART, Electron Energy Corporation, Lancaster County Solid Waste Management Authority, J Group, Eurofins, Redu, and Penstone. Now, Keith Williams truly embodies what it means to be a naturalist, someone whose passions for the outdoors, its creatures, its seasons, come together in tonight's presentation on spring ephemerals. He earned a bachelor's in environmental biology from Kutztown University and a master's of science in ecological teaching and learning from the Lesley University Audubon Expedition Institute. He's established outdoor education programs in China and established outdoor education programs for the U.S. Forest Service across the U.S. His first book, Snorkelhead, Adventures in River Snorkeling, was published in 2016, and his second river snorkeling book, Snorkeling Rivers, Streams, An Aquatic Guide to Underwater Discovery and Adventure, was published by Stackpole Books in March 2020. He's working on a third book, Insect Almanac. Keith is the Vice President for Engagement and Education at the Lancaster Conservancy, where he serves as the Conservancy's lead naturalist, develops and manages volunteer and education programs, and manages the Interpretive Ranger program. It is my pleasure to hand this program over to friend and colleague, Keith Williams.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Peggy. Can you all see that okay, Peggy?
I can see it fine, yep.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for that intro. And it's a pleasure working with you, Peggy, as a colleague and a fellow naturalist. And thank you all for being here tonight on this, really warm March night. And so, we didn't see much of this winter, did we? But typically, and even in this time of year, when we didn't get any snow this season yet, maybe Friday, kind of keep my fingers crossed a little bit, our wintertime woods kind of have a feel like this. Just doesn't feel like there's a whole lot going on in those woods, but pretty soon it's going to be this burst of energy like this. And here in our part of the world, in this beautiful Susquehanna Riverlands region, the ancestral places, the ancestral lands of the Susquehannock Indians and the Shanks Ferry people before them we are so blessed to have this incredible rush of wildflowers. We've got world-renowned wildflower preserves right here in our backyards. And it's all because of this incredible flush of energy and color and beauty and life that just seems to burst from the ground and last for like a month, and then it just goes away. And so we call these things ephemeral because from our perspective, that's exactly what they are. They're very temporary. But in reality, they're very, very long-lived organisms. In fact, what's going on in this picture that's not apparent is just beneath that snowpack is all this energy that's been stored up from the year before by these organisms is at work, and it's stirring right now. I mean, that is cranking away. It's starting to wake up metabolically, and it's really just waiting for this. It's just waiting for that right amount of sunlight to hit the forest floor. And these ephemeral plants, these things that we call ephemeral from our human perspective, feel like they live for such a short amount of time, right? That they between forest floor thaw and canopy leaf out, when that limiting factor of sunlight goes away, they do all their living, right? They sprout, they grow, they flower, they reproduce, they have their babies, and then they senesce and they die and they go away. But in reality, their lifespan's the entire year. They produce enough sugar, enough carbohydrate that they store in the roots, in their rootstocks and their corms to last them through that sunlight poor season. And so from an ecological perspective, they're really long-lived organisms. And one of the kind of the poster children of our spring ephemeral wildflowers are Virginia bluebells. You go to Shanks Ferry, one of the world-renowned wildflower preserves, and in probably about 3 weeks from now is when bluebells will be at peak, and you can taste the blue. It's that intense. And so these plants actually start getting desperate the longer the season goes, right? They don't do very good at self-pollinating. They really need an insect partner to accomplish reproduction in order for them to get pollinated. And so the longer the season goes without them getting pollinated, the darker the blue on their bells become because they need to get that pollinator in there. And then, there's a whole bunch of other plants that make up this palette, right? And so you notice all these blue flowers that are mixed in with those bluebells. And these are just really cool, interesting plants, right? These are nodding trilliums. And we've got a couple different trillium species. And interestingly enough, that's actually not really a true flower. Those are actually flowering bracts, which are essentially modified leaves, still there to attract the pollinator, right? So we got nodding trillium. And then what's that red thing? You're kind of bopping down the trail at Shanks, and you've got these beautiful kind of pastel, kind of softer colors like the blues and the whites. And then all of a sudden there's this red thing sitting there, and that's stinking Benjamin. And it's got that deep maroon color. And what do you think pollinates a plant with the name of stinking Benjamin that looks like rotting flesh? Yeah, you guessed it, dipterans, flies, right? And so we're going to talk a whole lot about pollination tonight, in addition to these beautiful wildflowers, because we need to expand our concept of what pollination is. And typically when we think pollination, we think, European honeybee. And certainly European honeybees play a pretty significant role in pollination, but they're not from here for starters, right? The European honeybee. And our native pollinators do so much more for pollination. And our native pollinators include organisms that aren't just hymenopterans, the bees. It includes things like dipterans. And so we have this other species of trillium, the Susquehanna trillium. We're really not sure what these are, right? So they're kind of a cross between the nodding trillium, all the white, and then you see that nice bright red center, that maroon center in the middle there. So they kind of look like stinking William. But they're in the middle, and science isn't really sure what to make of these Susquehanna trilliums so far. But either way, it doesn't really matter. You stink. And it's, again, this amazingly crafted co-evolved system of pollination that just doesn't always depend on what we as humans consider to be a pretty smelling flower. I mean, flies would love that stuff. Maybe not us so much when you smell it and it smells like something rotting. And speaking of something that isn't loved as much, and for some reason these poor skunk cabbages get left out of the spring ephemeral club, but they are incredibly intricate and interesting wildflowers that are really the earliest up. I mean, we see these in the first week of February here at Climbers Run. In fact, this picture was taken 2 winters ago. We didn't have any snow and ice this winter. Otherwise, we would have taken this picture from this winter. But those spades, right, the hoods of these skunk cabbages actually produce heat that can melt their way through snow and ice. So let's think about this for a minute. These are lowly plants that are actually metabolically generating heat so that they can get a jump on the spring sprout, right? So you got these hoods, these spades, and inside you've got this alien-looking egg thing, the spadix, that's covered in all these little yellow flowers that stink, and they attract flies to be their pollinators. And so it's this incredibly complex system of pollination that really blows my mind, because that includes so many more organisms than just the European honeybee or even bees alone. And then, you know, these skunk cabbages turn into these beautiful, huge, brilliant green leafy things that are just enormous. That's probably a 2-foot diameter plant right there. And they cover the entire bottomland forest floor. Anywhere there's a little bit of wet feet, these skunk cabbages are going to go nuts. And they'll last for about half through the summer, and then they senesce and go away. But, you know, turning back to a more traditional, what we consider to be a spring ephemeral wildflower are these beauties, right? Trout lilies, named for brook trout, the only native trout in the East. Brookies are the only trout that we have here that are native to the East Coast. And when you look at this, the leaf pattern on these trout lilies, that's where the trout lilies got their name, because they look like the sides of brook trout. These plants, this plant has to be at least 7 years old in order to produce that flower. So it takes them 7 years to become sexually mature. So right there, the concept of ephemerality, the concept of being here temporarily, is blown out of the water. This plant is at least 7 years old, and this plant is part of a colony that's maybe 200 to 300 years old, and only 1/3 of that colony will flower each year. So this is incredibly long-lived. These are incredibly long-lived organisms that depend on, again, pollinators for their survival, right? Like this digger bee. Digger bees are a native. In fact, we've got a colony of digger bees here at Climbers that we just went out into the meadow yesterday to see if they were back again. And sure enough, this week, every year, those digger bees reappear rather. The females dig burrows into the soil. They lay their eggs. They provision their eggs with some pollen and some nectar that they're getting from, you know, these trout lilies and some other plants. And then the cycle starts over again. It's one of the most fascinating things that we can watch in the early spring. And this beetle is also partially responsible. It's a longhorn beetle, is responsible for pollinating trout lilies. And then we have another classic spring ephemeral wildflower, Dutchman's breeches, right? Named for the flower that looks like pantaloons or pants, right, hanging on a line, Dutchman's breeches. Dicentra is the genus, and so Dicentra refers to these really deeply cut leaves. And we'll talk about Dicentra, another species of Dicentra, coming up here in a minute. But what's also not obvious in this picture, besides all the energy that is just below the surface in the form of spring wildflowers that have stored all that starch and sugar in the rootstocks, are queen bumbles, right? So a queen bumblebee, even if you don't spell it with a second E after the L there, is that she's the only survivor from her colony from the year before, right? So she was mated in the fall. She's the only one that survives over the wintertime. And what she does is she finds an old burrow or leaves that are laying on the ground, and she snuggles in there for the wintertime where she estivates. This is something that we can all do to improve ecosystem resilience, to improve biodiversity, something as simple as leaving the leaves so that those queen bumbles have a place to overwinter and to estivate through the cold months. When she emerges, she's starving. So she's one of the earliest insects to emerge in the spring, coincided with the emergence of Dutchman's breeches, which is one of the earliest wildflowers to emerge. And that's no coincidence. This is a 33 million year relationship between the queen and her breeches. And she's starving. She needs nectar and she needs pollen, and she needs it yesterday. And she needs it for her, and she needs it for the babies that she's carrying inside of her. And so she goes, and she's just going to hold in a hover, and that's her tongue sticking out the front of her. That long thing is not a sting. She's got a stinger in the back. That's a tongue that she's going to use to get into that nectar that is hidden deep within that flower, right? Because that flower wants that bee to get the pollen. This is a reciprocal relationship. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that for us humans, in that each partner is getting something from the relationship. It's not extractive, right? The bee is getting nourishment. She's getting nectar and she's getting pollen for her nourishment and for the nourishment of her babies. And the Dutchman's breeches are getting pollinated. They get fertilized to make more babies of their own kind by the bee transporting pollen from flower to flower. So there's reciprocity there. And I think if we, as humans, took that concept of reciprocity to heart and really acted in that way, we'd be much further along in solving the significant environmental problems that we face as a species on this planet today. And I just love watching those bee tongues. It's just incredible. And the hover. I mean, just such talent with these, look at that, with these incredible insects, and the relationship that's been formed over 33 million years, the reciprocal relationship that's been formed over 33 million years between this beautiful plant and this beautiful insect. And, this plant is closely related to this one, squirrel corn, right? There's that genus Dicentra, and look at the leaves. The leaves are very similar, but they could be easily confused, right? Dicentra looks more like, squirrel corn, canadensis, looks more like a heart rather than the Dutchman's breeches, which looks more like the pants. But you can see that cut leaf on the base there look kind of similar. Another early spring ephemeral wildflower is cut leaf toothwort. Again, the cut leaf kind of makes a lot of sense, right? Take a look at those leaves and they're cut, so that common names make sense. Toothwort is a little bit more hidden, that if you were to dig up this plant, and we don't want you to do that, obviously, because that plant would not survive getting dug up. And we'll talk about plant theft here in a minute. One of the things that we face the plants face as a threat is people digging them up. This plant won't survive transplanting. But if you were to dig that up, you'd find these little growths along the roots that look like teeth. They look like dentition. And it's kind of fascinating how the toothwort name evolved from the rootstock of this plant. And so every plant that we've talked about so far, except I think for the skunk cabbage, produces seeds that are spread by ants. So ants are responsible for spreading between 30 and 40% of the woodland spring wildflower seeds, which is an incredible number. And they bioturbate, they turn over, something like 3 tons of soil per acre per year. So they're incredibly important biologically. And the plants recognize this, right? So this is another amazing strategy that plants have. And we've already talked about a couple. They attach a packet of fat or sugar to the seed called an elaiosome. And they know that ant is going to want that packet of fat and sugar. So the plant ants grab the packet of sugar and fat, and they carry that along with the attached seed back to their colony. And they eat the fat and the sugar, and they're kind of sitting around fat and happy. And they either take the seed and they throw it on the trash heap outside their colony, or they just leave it in the colony. But either way, that seed was just planted in really, really rich, fertile, well aerated soil. So another amazing strategy. The first one was, timing their entire living in a short window of a month or two between forest floor thaw and canopy leaf out, right? So these plants grow, they sprout, they grow, they reproduce, and they store up, they photosynthesize enough sugars and carbohydrates to store in the roots to get them through until this time next year. Then they've got these really intricate relationships that ensures that they get pollinated in the right way by the right organism at the right time. And then, but wait, there's more, right? They attach this packet of fat or sugar to their seed to make sure that the ants will grab it and take it back to their colony to guarantee that their babies get planted in the best possible soil, right? But they're just plants. So here's my favorite, right? One of my favorites, red columbine. I grew up with these plants on the shores of the Delaware River, New Jersey and Pennsylvania. They like really, really rocky outcrops. And that's where we find them on our preserves, where we have really, really thin soils on these exposed rocks, is where we're going to find these red columbines. Just an absolutely beautiful plant. These are usually later in the season. So, what we talked about so far have been things that are going to be coming up here in the next couple of weeks. And some of them have started already. The columbines are going to be coming in, about a month from now. And this one is a dusky wing skipper. Right. So it's a columbine dusky wing skipper, which is critically endangered in the state of Pennsylvania. And its host plant is that columbine. And so this is an insect that's going away in my lifetime that used to be abundant here. And there's a really good chance it's going to be gone before I'm gone. And part of that reason is because the columbine's going away. And these are up now, spring beauties, Claytonia virginica, these beautiful little tiny dainty white flowers with the pink veins, purplish veins in there. And this is another one that's pollinated by digger bees, right? So there's another relationship that you're starting to see, maybe a trend of digger bees and some of these early spring wildflowers, because the digger bees are some of the first bees to emerge in the springtime. And look at those leg warmers on those back legs. Do you see them? So bees have these specialized structures that are called pollen baskets on their back legs. And that pollen that looks like cotton candy there, that kind of pinkish cotton candy, is the color of the pollen that's coming off of those spring beauties that these digger bees are carrying around with them. And there's another beetle, right? There's a beetle on a spring beauty. So don't rule out other kinds of organisms besides the hymenopterans. The hymenopterans being the wasps and the bees and the ants as pollinators. The coleopterans, the beetles, are also playing a role. So are the dipterans, right? The dipterans are the flies. And that's a ground beetle. I don't know what kind that little beetle was, but that's a ground beetle, again, on a spring beauty. And I just love those digger bees and how much pollen they get covered in and carry around. This is a really cool plant, completely alien looking, crazy, big umbrella looking thing, about a foot tall on the forest floor. This is another one that will be a little bit later in the season. If you look underneath that umbrella, you're going to find these buds, and these buds start looking like the plant on Little Shop of Horrors. I think, what was the name of it? Audrey 2, right? The carnivorous plant that needed blood. Feed me, Henry, you know, that one. They turn into these beautiful white blossoms that are pollinated by a whole bunch of different kinds of insects. And then, you know, I'd really be remiss if I left out the flowering shrubs. They get left out because they're not a spring wildflower. Obviously, they're a shrub, but they certainly add to the color palette of our landscape every year. And so the yellow flowers that you see here are spice bush, this beautiful native shrub that is the host plant to spice bush swallowtails. And so that gray thing that you see right there in the middle of the screen is actually a cocoon or chrysalis of a spice bush swallowtail. So inside that is this caterpillar who is being biochemically completely reorganized to emerge as this beauty, right? A spice bush swallowtail. And this spice bush swallowtail in this picture is actually nectaring on a Turk's Head lily at our Climbers Run Preserve. So this was taken in July. An important part to note here, though, is when we talk about lepidopteran conservation, right? Butterfly conservation. A lot of times we focus in on the host plants, which are really important, right? So a lot of times the caterpillar of these butterflies are dependent on one particular kind of plant. In this case, they're dependent on spice bush. In the case of a monarch butterfly, they're dependent on milkweed. So it's important that we make sure that we have host plants in our landscape. But at the same time, they nectar from a whole bunch of different sources. And so it's really important that we have diversity of native plants in our landscape, both our wild landscapes and our manicured landscapes. And I'd be really, really remiss if I left this one out when we're talking about flowering shrubs in our springtime color palette. This is a fan favorite. It's got a cult following that's emerging. I heard their third album's coming out next week. You can make a beer out of it. Ladies and gentlemen, the pawpaw. Guess what that smells like? Look at the color. Look who's pollinating it. It's supposed to smell like rotting stuff. When I smell a pawpaw flower, I don't smell anything rotting, but apparently that fly does. And, you know, it doesn't matter what I smell. It matters what the fly smells. So there you have it. That pawpaw is pollinated by flies. And it's the host plant for this beauty, the tiger swallowtail. I'm sorry, the zebra swallowtail. Really, really pale, greenish with these beautiful, one of the longest tailed butterflies that we have around here. And, you know, the more traditional wildflower and one of the first emerging that we'll start seeing here, I expect any day now, are these beautiful bloodroots. I mean, look at the color on them. But these are pretty sneaky little plants, right? They don't have any nectar. So they're putting it all out there saying, hey, insects, come and check me out. You're going to get a good meal. You're going to get some nectar over here. And then insect gets there, there's no nectar. And then bloodroot's kind of like psych. But they do get pollen, right? Think about it. Nectar generation is pretty energetically taxing. And so it makes a lot of sense that bloodroot would not put a whole lot of energy into nectar production. And the other piece of this that's kind of interesting is if you look at these two dark things here, these grayish black things, look at the feathery antennas on them. First of all, that's pretty striking. They're probably males, and they probably communicate by pheromone, by chemical. These are flies. These are another dipteran species. They're midges. And I got to wonder if they don't play a role in pollinating bloodroot. Pretty fascinating relationships that we don't fully understand yet. This is a cool one. This is blue cohosh. And this will look like this dusky blue looking thing. And then they get these really dainty flowers, yellow flowers on the ends of it. There are parts of our preserves in the Riverlands that are just whole hillsides will be covered in blue cohosh. And this is another classic. This is a jack in the pulpit. So you've got the spades, right? You've got that hooded leaf that kind of flips over the jack in the pulpit. So that hood is the pulpit. If you flip that leaf, that flap up, you look inside, you'll see the spadix, which is the jack, and that's the flower. And we've got a bunch of non-natives that confuse people. And so, you know, come and visit us at Shanks Ferry starting in about 2 weeks. We're going to have our rangers are going to be there. We're going to have volunteers. Our amazing outreach volunteers will be at a table to welcome people to the preserves and point them into the right direction and let them know what's blooming when. And when we have that table up, we get a lot of questions about plants like this, these non-native. This is Star of Bethlehem. This is a landscape escapee. But look at that halictid bee, right? Halictids are metallic green sweat bees. Some of my favorites. Just, you know, how do insects get that kind of color on them for starters? But look at the color against this Star of Bethlehem. That insect just looks like, man, what a party. right? Look at the pollen that that thing is covering from one Star of Bethlehem to the next. And then we have Veronicas, right? Speedwells, another one that's not native, and that's a hoverfly. So here we go again with the dipterans, right? It's a fly. It's in the dipteran order, and covered in pollen, and just beautiful. Scillas, we have a real problem with scillas on some of our preserves. In my opinion, Scilla in some places on our preserves are bordering on invasive. So, you've got these different classifications, right? You've got non-native, which means not from here. Doesn't mean that it's invasive. Non-native and naturalized, which means they're not from here and they become part of the fabric of the ecosystem. So not necessarily a bad actor. I'm not suggesting that we plant non-native stuff everywhere, but a lot of times once the genie's out of the bag, you can't, or out of the bottle, you can't get it back in. And then you have invasive, right? And invasive organisms, we typically refer to plants as invasive, but other things can be invasive too. Get into an ecosystem and they take over because they don't have the typical population controls that they would have had in place from wherever they came, and have a negative effect. And that negative effect is often a reduction of other biodiversity. And I'm starting to see Scilla pop up at some of our preserves in such density that I got to start wondering if it's not impacting by outcompeting some of our native stuff. So it's something that we're definitely keeping an eye on. And then we got violets, right? And we've got violets all over the place. I got blue violets in my lawn, which I love, but they're not native. So they really don't do a service to all the native insects that depend on those native violets. Something like this blue violet, right, which I think is a native species, would be the host plant for this beautiful thing. This is a regal fritillary, critically endangered in the state of Pennsylvania, being considered for listing on the U.S. under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. Again, another animal that's going away in my lifetime. I'm not okay with leaving this world with less species on it for my grandson that's about to be born on the 15th. That just doesn't sit well. It doesn't sit okay with me. And this fritillary is going away partly because these are going away, right? This is their habitat. That's what they need. And these are going away because this is happening, right? There's not going to be any violets growing on this 2-acre site. There's not going to be Dutchman's breech. There's not going to be columbine. There's not going to be columbine dusky wing skippers. The habitat's gone. That's going away. And this is happening globally. So this is an index of biodiversity. And basically anything on this index, the way this is calculated, anything below a 1 indicates we're losing biodiversity. And so look at what happened in my lifetime between 1970 and 16. This is only invertebrates. This particular graph does not use any data from invertebrates because we just started looking at invertebrate species. This is a relatively new phenomenon. We decided that we should start tracking insect populations. When we do that, take a look at this, right? Insects, 41% of insect species are threatened with extinction. They've got a 10% extinction rate, right? When we look at vertebrates, 22% of vertebrates. So half of the number of insects are threatened with extinction with about a 2% extinction rate. So we are losing invertebrates, insects specifically, at a frightening pace. And if you look at who's leading that, right? Trichoptera are caddisflies, they're aquatics. Look at the leps, the lepidopters, right? Are butterflies and moths, right? They're right at about 35% are listed as threatened with extinction. Bees and ants, 15% extinction rate for bees and ants, the workhorses of our pollination system. Because of this, we're losing habitat that these organisms depend on. And that habitat loss is coming from development. It's coming from these things, invasive species. We already talked a little bit about invasives, right? All these white flowers, this is a big driver in our region. This is garlic mustard. It's a relatively short-lived biennial plant. It's got this above ground portion, this flower spike in year 2, and it lasts for about 2 months. That, oh, by the way, happens to coincide when all of our spring ephemeral wildflowers are up. So removing this in the wrong way has the potential for doing a lot of damage. And so we are actively managing garlic mustard on a couple of our preserves, including Shanks Ferry. And it's a real little delicate dance that we do with putting people off trail to pull this stuff without damaging the wildflowers that happen to be up at the same time. And so, kudos to our volunteer land stores last year. We pulled 1,500 gallons of this stuff out of Shanks Ferry alone. And for the first time last year, I really felt encouraged that we could get ahead of garlic. I've been going to Shanks for about 30 years. And Last year was the first year where I actually felt hopeful that it wasn't going to get overrun by garlic musk. We're going to lose the diversity of the native plants there to an invasive. This is another new invader, though. If you see these yellow flowers right here, this is celandine surrounding Dutchman's breeches. And this is also at Shanks. This is also at Shanks. You see that monoculture. This stuff is a nasty actor. It's extremely difficult to get rid of. You can see how there's no diversity there. It's just celandine. And this is in Shanks Ferry right now. And we are fighting. It's a full-on battle against this stuff. You can't dig it out because it's got these tiny little root bulblets. You can't get rid of all of it. So we try to weed eat this before it goes to seed. And so we're basically taking the energy away from the rootstock. And over multiple years of mechanical treatment like that, the idea is that it won't spread because it won't go to seed. And we'll take that energy away from the rootstock eventually, and we'll start dying back. But it's a nonstop battle. And then there's us, right? We are a threat to these beautiful native wildflowers and all the other life that depends on them. And I'm as guilty as anybody, right? I love doing macro photography. And, you know, there's this beautiful bee that I just want to get a picture of that's like 3 feet off the trail. And so if I just take it's just one step. I mean, come on, it's not that big of a deal. I'm just taking one step off the trail, multiply my one step by the hundreds of people that visit Shanks Ferry every day through a 2-month span. And all of a sudden it's a couple thousand steps that are stepping on those plants. And those plants aren't that robust. Those plants aren't designed to take a full weight of a human and bounce back. Those stems get snapped. And if we snap that stem, that stops the ability for that plant to reproduce and have babies and continue that population right there. And then there's Fido, my favorite. I am not an anti-dog person. I got 2 at home, and that's an all-time low for me. I usually have 3 to 4. I am anti-dog off lead on our preserves. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. That animal, that dog running through the preserve off trail does significant damage to wildlife. They kick wildlife up and chase wildlife. They do significant damage to wildflowers by trampling. They go to the bathroom, right? And invariably we find, you know, dog poo bags all over the place. Don't understand the reasoning behind going through the hassle of actually picking up dog waste in the bag and then tossing the bag on preserve. And then it ruins other people's experience of the preserve, right? So your dog's running off lead, and you know they run up to another person who doesn't like dogs so much, and it's okay, they're friendly. Well, that other person doesn't know that they're friendly, right? And their preserve experience was just diminished. So, you know, bring your dogs out to the preserve for sure. Keep them on lead. And there is no dog poop ferry that works for the Conservancy, so take your dog poop with you. And plant theft. Who'd have thought that plant people would steal stuff from the wild to transplant to their yards? But yes, it's our reality. And so this is last year, 2 years ago. I'm out at Shanks Ferry, and I'm working along. There's a railroad right there, and anybody who's been down there, you know the site, right? So it's a railroad, and there's an access road called the Drunk Highway, and it's got the name the Drunk Highway because you're not supposed to drive on it, but you can avoid detection by law enforcement, apparently, by illegally trespassing on railroad property. It's a railroad access road that runs alongside the railroad tracks. And so I'm there and I'm digging up celandine. We got a patch of celandine that I'm digging up, and it's in the middle of the day, it's in the middle of the week, and there's this old beat up pickup truck rattling down the Drunk Highway. And it stops right where I'm working, and the window rolls down, and this guy goes, "Hey, you, quit digging up them plants." And I'm like, "Hey, man, thank you for looking out for the place. It's okay. I work for the Conservancy. I'm getting rid of this nasty invasive stuff. But man, thank you for taking care of the place. You know, really totally restored my faith in humanity." But every single season, we get reports and we catch people walking out of Shanks with arms full of stuff that they dug up, and they know exactly what they're doing because they're targeting rare species and they're taking them home to plant them in their yards. And what they're doing is they're ruining the ecology. Those plants are not designed to live in a yard, dug up from the wild. If you want that, go to Prairie Moon Nursery, go to Hungry Hook Farm, and they'll provide you the plant stock that will survive in your yard. But don't take it from the preserve. It's not going to survive the transplant. So all those things that we do that we don't even think are decisions, right? We're not even processing that as a decision-making thing. It's just one step off trail. It's just my dog off lead. I'm only going to dig up 2 plants. They all add up, and each one of those actions leads to the loss of this plant, right? I take one step off trail and I snap that stem and it's done. my dog goes off trail and steps on that plant or does something much more disrespectful to that beautiful trout lily, and that life is over. And again, this plant, this organism needs to be at least 7 years old to get to that point of flowering. So that organism is at least 7, probably older, because that's part of a colony that's between 200 and 300 years old. And only a third of that colony will flower in any one given season. And all of those decisions that we don't think matter add up and result in the loss of these, right? The regal fritillary being lost because it's losing its grassland prairie habitat that we need, that we had here in our part of Pennsylvania. The rusty patch bumblebee in the upper right that we're going to talk about here in a minute. The frosted elephant in the lower right. And then in the lower left, the American bumblebee, Bombus pennsylvanicus, the American bumblebee with our state name in it. We should be ashamed of ourselves by letting that thing go, right? And here's a good example of the rusty patch and those decisions that we're making that we don't think matter, right? This isn't around here. The Belleville Prairie is a 25-acre patch of gravel prairie in Illinois. It's at the end of the Rockford Airport. So you see that hangar right there, right? That's the end of the runway on Rockford Airport. The rusty patch bumblebee is a federally listed organism under the Endangered Species Act, and it lives on this 25-acre patch of remnant gravel prairie at the Rockford Airport. The FAA this week just gave approval to extend that runway through this patch and eliminate the rusty patch bumblebee from this habitat. So we as a culture are saying we're okay with this. We're okay with trading this species' existence for a longer runway at Rockford so that Amazon can ship more crap to us. That's the conscious decision that we as a society are making right now. And so who cares, right? It's just bugs. What difference does it make, right? It's us. We're part of this fabric that we call the biosphere. And everything on this planet rides on the back of an insect. We depend on the backs of those insects. And those insects depend on this 33 million year old relationship between them and their plants. And so there's a couple of things that we can do to help. And one of those things is plant native. I'm so encouraged by the interest that we have in our habitat advocate classes, that we've got 190 some people that are engaged in this training of learning how to do native plants and native landscaping on their properties, whether they've got a little flower pot or they got 100 acres. And so that is a huge step in the right direction for our community. The fact that the Lancaster Conservancy has protected 10,000 acres in our 53-year history is huge, because those 10,000 acres serve as those biodiversity sources that, as we convert our lawns to native plants again, will serve as the source material for these insects to recolonize those new habitats that we're creating. And so there's a lot of hope attached to this. This is not despair. This is a lot of hope. And so one of the things you can do is plant native, and learn what that is. There are tons of resources available online. The Conservancy is a resource for that information as well. Go to Shanks Ferry, right, and pick up one of these field guides that was beautifully designed by our communications team of Kelly Snavely and Kristen Stangl and Avery Van Etten. Just masters at communicating the beauty of places that we protect, like Shanks Ferry, to the folks that are coming and visiting. Stop by the table with our volunteers and our rangers there, pick up a brochure, learn what's in bloom that day, and then get out there and appreciate the beauty that's there. But rather than running through the preserve at a breakneck pace like this, maybe take a slower pace and pick up a place to have a seat on trail. Though we don't want you snapping plants, right? That would be bad. But find a nice place on the trail, have a seat, and watch the relationship between the bumblebee and her breeches at a pace like this. Oh, it won't play. Anyway, take your time with it. Observe those amazing relationships that have formed over 33 million years. And while you're doing that, think about how you can keep it wild. And thanks for being with us, everybody.
Yay, Keith. Thank you so much. All right. You ready for some questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've got quite a few, actually. So I'm just going to scroll through and start at the top. This question comes to you from Anita. She's asking, is harm caused to pollinating insects or plants by insects collecting pollen from non-natives such as Star of Bethlehem or speedwell?
Great question. The science is still out on that. We know that some of the non-native plants don't have the nutritional value in their pollen and their nectar that natives do, right? So like butterfly bush was a great example. I had that all over my yard because it was attracting butterflies, but it's like eating McDonald's every day, right? Not very nutritionally valid for those butterflies. And so I got rid of that from my landscape. Now, the caveat to that is when you buy a non-native plant from a box store, a lot of times that's been treated with a neonic insecticide. And we know that those neonics are extremely long-lived. It gets into the pollen. And if that plant has been treated by a neonic, that can leave that plant and actually be carried away from it and still have a negative effect on those insects. So if the plant's not been treated with neonics, we're not sure about the negative effect on other plants. I don't think the pollen from a non-native would have a negative effect on a native, but it might have a negative effect on that insect that's counting on that to be nutritionally valid. And if it's been treated with neonics, then certainly it's going to have a negative effect.
Okay. Next question is from Charlotte. You may have touched on this a little bit, but she's asking in regards to species going away, how can we be custodians to prevent that? Is there a way we can reintroduce them to new places while out on walks, like mushrooms or spores?
Yeah, so the best way, it's not that simple actually, right? So it's a really difficult proposition to do ecological restoration. The Conservancy is actively involved in that, but it's not really just a matter of going and sprinkling some seeds down. It takes a lot of work to get rid of the invasives that have kind of gotten in there and taken over. It takes a lot of site prep. The success of meadow restoration or a native landscaping project is really rooted in the site preparation. So there are certainly ways that we can reverse this trend and reintroduce species. And one of those ways is by doing native landscaping on our properties, right? Pulling out the non-native stuff that I was putting in my yard I was trying to do native planting for the last, I started that 25 years ago on my place, and I was putting stuff in the ground that I thought was native and it's not. And now we know, right? And so I'm in the process of converting all that crap, that non-native stuff, and putting native stuff in. But it's not like we can just snap our fingers and reverse it. It takes a lot of work.
Mm-hmm. It does take a lot of work. In fact, Doris is asking this. She says, "Thanks so much for the wonderful talk. And alas, sobering news. Could you please provide some tips for controlling weeding, lesser celandine, and stars of Bethlehem?" She says, "Unfortunately, have these populating my home garden. And is it true that if you dig them out in early spring before they flower, can one hope to eradicate without spreading?"
Yes, that is true. So if you get them before they flower, celandine is a really prolific seeder, right? And so that's the threat, that if they flower, they haven't produced seed yet, but they're getting close, right? So you can dig them out if you've got a smaller patch. That's definitely the preferred method of getting rid of celandine. The problem is those rootlets, the bulblets, are so tiny. They're like little gravel grains. So it's going to take multiple years of treatment to get rid of them. But digging them out is certainly the way to go. Bag them up and throw them in the trash, right? Like seal the bag and throw them in the trash. If you start doing that after they flower, there's a chance that some of those flowers have already produced seed. And then there's a chance you're just going to spread it some more. So timing is pretty important on that. And Star of Bethlehem is less of a prolific seeder, but you can do the same thing by digging up the corms, the little bulblets on the Star of Bethlehem.
Okay. Anita's asking, how does human life depend on the survival of these insects?
I mean, every third bite of food that you take is pollinated by a wild type insect. So our food system, our pollinating system is dependent on these insects. And beyond the hymenopterans, right, beyond the bees, we talked a bunch of examples of other insects like beetles. And then there's the decomposers. Flies. Think about what this world would smell like if flies weren't laying their eggs on nasty stuff like dead things and poop to eat that. And there's a bunch of beetles that do the same thing. And so insects are incredibly important for nutrient cycling. They're incredibly important for food pollination, and just about every geochemical process that we depend on, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, the carbon cycle. Insects are critically important role players in those cycles.
So here's a question from a concerned hiker. That's what I have. A concerned hiker is asking, that you mentioned ground nesting digger bees and emerging from colonies, or as a pollinator ecologist, this would be like a eurosocial kind of colony, not like a nest. But do they sting? And should hikers be concerned when they come across one of these colonies?
Yeah, no, I was just yesterday, a friend of mine and I were out in the Climbers Run Meadow. We were face to face with these. They are extremely, I mean, every hymenopteron has, every bee has a stinger, right? These are extremely docile bees. And great clarification, Peggy. These are solo nesting bees. They're solitary bees, right? So there's only one bee going in the ground. It's the female, and she's laying some eggs. I was just back out there today, and I was face to face with them with my camera, and they were flying all around me, and not a problem whatever. They're not like a yellow jacket colony. Yellow jackets have an attitude problem, and they are a social bee, right? So there are hundreds of bees that live in that tiny hole in that yellow jacket colony. These ground nesting digger bees are individual nesters. You might find like a dozen holes in the same area, but there's nothing. They pose no threat to a hiker.
Okay. Here's one concerning evolution and coevolution. So you said that some of the relationships that we have right on our preserves between the pollinators and their plants are millions of years old. And of course, those relationships are dependent upon when those flowers bloom, how long they bloom. And the question is asking, with climate change and accelerating seasons, but like spring coming sooner than later, is there an issue? Is there a concern about bees or other pollinators being out of sync with their pollen and nectar plants coming up earlier than the insect will hatch out or emerge?
Absolutely. In fact, I was just in a webinar for the last 2 days with the Xerces Society about a pollinator conservation symposium, and that was a lead topic of multiple talks, how the phenology of the timing of emergence is shifting and changing. And it's not just that the plants are blooming earlier, it's actually some of the bees are coming out earlier because we have warmer days, and they need nectar earlier. In fact, I think Bill Sprankle might be on this. He's one of our volunteer lancers, he's a beekeeper. And he was out working at Wizard Ranch with us last week, and he was telling me how much sugar he has to put out into his hives earlier in the season because his bees are getting active earlier because of the warmth, right? And the nectar sources aren't there yet. So that is a huge concern. And it's actually one of the reasons why we're seeing declines in insect numbers in general, but pollinators specifically, is, that climate shift of getting the timing out of sync. That queen bumblebee and the Dutchman's breeches emergence is so intimately timed, is a great example. And that if that gets out of sync and that queen bumble can't find a commensurate source of nutrition from another plant, then they're going to go away. I mean, Peggy, you did research for your doctorate program in a species of bumble that we were hoping was moving either up in altitude or up in latitude because of climate. And you found that they weren't able to keep pace, if I remember right.
Yeah, they're not able to keep pace with the advancing changes, I guess accelerating changes. They just can't.
So that's yep. Certainly an emerging concern.
Yep.
But the solution to that, though, is diversity of plants in our landscape, right? So the more diverse plants that we put, the more diverse native plants that we put in whatever patch of ground we're here to steward while we're on this planet, the better the chances of survival for everything else that depends on those nectar sources.
All right, 2 more questions. You want to field these? These are plant related.
Yeah.
Kelly is asking, is aconite, ACONITE, native?
I would have to look that one up. I'm not familiar with aconite. Do you know that one, Peggy?
Either, no, not at all.
Kelly, I'll look it up and I'll send me an email and I'll find out for you.
Yeah. And Leonard also asking about non-natives. Any suggestions on getting rid of? He has here chameleon plant. I'm not familiar with.
Is there another name for that one? I'm not familiar with chameleon plant either.
I'll
have to look that one up too.
So Leonard, if you could send an email, maybe with a picture or a description of the plant that we can cross-check against our native, non-native inventory. So this is one question. This is actually coming from my grandson.
Cool.
Anyway, so Aiden, who is an up-and-coming beekeeper, is asking, Do late winter storms like snowstorms or hard freezes affect early blooming wildflowers?
I don't think so, but that's a great question, right? So I know that if we had a hard frost, that we would start losing like cherry blossoms. And so especially that's part of the concern with climate, that if these plants start to put their energy in the blossom production early, and then we get a hard frost, this system that basically goes back to normal for a little while, those blooms are going to be lost to freezing and frost. So there's the potential negative effect there. But I don't think they affect the longevity of the plant, but it's certainly going to affect their ability to reproduce.
Very true. I don't have any more questions on either one of the lists that we're running here. Okay, so Doris is clarifying. Winter aconite is native to Asia Minor and Europe.
I'll have to look that one up.
Yeah. Yeah, we're gonna have to look at this one, Doris. So give us a little bit to take a look and study on it. And yeah, it looks interesting. It's a relative in the buttercup family. So I guess I had a question, and I don't know, because you and I do restoration work, and we're out at Climbers Run doing a lot of work out there for invasive removal. And I'm thinking, we've got these great early emerging native and solitary bees, whether they're in loose colonies or on their own. I wonder if there's anything we can do to the ground, and I'm going off of an experience I had with a playground that had covered the surface underneath swing sets and all with kind of a sand, right? And that attracted digger bees within 2 years, and they actually they sprayed the playground not knowing what the diggers were. But after they learned about what they were, the playground simply got roped off in succeeding years so that diggers could and did return. I'm wondering if can we rake open patches of ground, or are there ways to attract these bees to fresh earth?
That's a great question. And actually that was a topic of one of the sessions today with the Xerces Society was, we're thinking about pollinator conservation. We typically hone in on just the host plant kind of thing, and not the whole life history requirement. So part of that is nesting habitat. And so we can produce, or we can provide those bare patches, right? And some of those minor bee species, there's 22,000 species of bee in North America or something crazy like that, right? So we're talking about a lot of different possibilities. Some of them require clay, some like a sandier soil, some like a loam. So even putting a patch of clay down, or putting some sand down and raking open a patch of typical garden soil would be beneficial for them. Also, leaving large woody material, logs. There's a lot of solitary bees that need dead wood in order to nest. And in fact, a lot of our halictids, those beautiful green metallic sweat bees, different species of them will burrow into dead wood. Leave the stems. Leave your garden looking messy. A lot of the solitary cavity nesters will lay their eggs in the hollow part of stems. And so the recommendation is, in early spring, cut the stems back to between 2 feet and 6 inches. Vary the height and leave them up. Don't take them down any further than that. And that hollow stem that's left there will encourage some of those solitary nesters to go and lay their eggs in those
and that's
hollow
happening
tubes.
now. That's
it's
happening
now. Right.
For those of us who are cutting back, just leave about this much above your coneflower or whatever, rudbeckia, and those stems become almost instantly found. It's amazing.
And that's a better option than the bee hotels, right? A bee hotel basically mimics those native hollow stems. Bee hotels aren't necessarily bad in and of themselves, but there's some negative pieces associated with the bee hotel if they're not constructed right, if they're not managed right. Whereas using those native habitats, like a patch of bare ground, like some woody material that you leave in your garden or in your yard, and those hollow stems left standing, eliminate the negatives attached to the bee hotels.
Yep. Well, I am looking, we have, okay, do you want to do one more question?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
But, so yeah, let me just answer one that's easy to answer. Yes, the Nature Hour programs are recorded and they are archived for you to see, our Conservancy TV. You can find that on our webpage. Here's a question to talk about Shanks Ferry. This is from Marion. When is a good time to visit
Yeah, great question. So in terms of bloom, peak bloom, it's usually right around Easter weekend. It might be a little bit earlier this year. We had some spring beauties coming up 2 weeks ago. We had a couple of bluebells that were just starting to pop. But pretty much, if you go there like right around Easter Sunday, right around Easter weekend, you're going to be at peak bloom. It is packed on the weekends. We see 300, 400 people on a Saturday and Sunday each day. 300 people on Saturday, 300 people on Sunday for about 4 weeks. And so a good time to visit would be a weekday rather than a weekend because there's fewer people. And in terms of peak bloom, figure right about Easter.
It gets crazy out there.
Yeah.
But Shanks Ferry isn't the only preserve that you can visit to see. It's probably the showiest. But there are other preserves that Lancaster Conservancy manages, and one of those is Ferncliff, which is southern Lancaster County on the river. Anywhere where you have like a deep ravine kind of environment, slopey ground, rich soils, and a south-facing slope, you can pretty much bet that you're going to see at least, some spring wildflowers. But for those preserves like Shanks Ferry, like Ferncliff, they're just so abundant. It's a showstopper, and they do get crowded out there.
They get crowded. Welsh Mountain's another option. Even though Welsh is a pretty different ecosystem, it has different flowers, but it's got some pretty amazing spring ephemerals up there.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. Go out and see all of them, guys. Don't just visit one. Yeah. So I think I'm going to call it there because we're hitting 7 o'clock. Keith, this has been a lot of fun again.
Well, thanks, Peggy. Thank everybody for tuning in tonight.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and do look for this recorded Nature Hour soon in our library, which you can find on our webpage. And if anyone else has anything to say, Keith, Avery, that's a wrap. Thanks everybody for a great season.
Good night.